Hello, I'm Lucy.
And I'm Michelle.
And we're on to the third episode of Columbus.
3.
Yes.
A nicer one.
Last week's was depressing,
Yes.
distressing,
Yes.
miserable.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to make any apologies for that.
No, it's important.
Yes, I've listened to a couple of podcasts about Columbus and they've said, and he performed some atrocities. He wasn't very nice to the natives. And I just think that's too easy to say.
Yeah.
I had no idea of the scale until I actually researched it.
And us growing up weren't told at all. I asked a few of my friends that are around my age, and they're like, no, you celebrate Columbus. He found us. I'm like, what about all the bad things he did? And they give you a blank look. I don't know if they teach it now, but no idea. No idea.
I knew he was, he'd been up to no good, shall we say.
Okay.
But I had no idea of the sheer scale of it.
Yeah.
So, sorry if people were upset by it, but I mean, I didn't do it. Don't shoot the messenger.
Yes. It is important to know.
It is, and it wasn't a very nice one to do. But this one is a lot nicer because we don't actually hear a lot about the Indians in this one. It's mainly what the Spanish are up to.
Okay.
And it's amazing how quickly it all just goes to hell in a handcart.
They deserve it to go to hell in a
Well,
handcart,
precisely.
really.
I thought there's some things that happen in this that you're going to think, ha!
I'm looking forward to this.
You had that coming. Anyway, we left Columbus, heading back to Spain, in disgrace again, having to go and explain himself to Ferdinand and Isabella. Anyway, this time it was the priest that was with them, who went back and knocked on him, grassed him out.
Good.
And said, you won't believe what these people are up to. So now, Columbus has got to go back and explain himself. And he found the overland journey to speak to Ferdinand and Isabella extremely onerous. Because if you remember, his eyesight was troubling him.
Oh, yeah.
As were his joints. He's really not in a good way.
Good.
He looked old. His hair had gone completely white.
Already? Oh, well,
Yeah.
I guess that's not... I shouldn't be surprised by that. There are people that
No,
start
I think
going grey in their
I don't think it's
teens.
quite like you get in Victorian novels where people's hair goes white overnight because
Yes.
they've seen a ghost or something.
Yes.
But I get the impression it wasn't white when he left and it was when he got back.
Okay.
And on top of that, he had gout.
Haha.
Well, you would think the sort of life he'd been living, that at least it would mean he wouldn't get gout because he's not exactly been eating the richest food.
Oh, right.
And he's not sedentary.
But are they not eating vegetables?
Yeah, he's got gout.
I actually don't know what causes gout.
I don't know. It's crystals forming in the blood, isn't it? Which is incredibly painful.
Yeah, and affects the lower limbs most, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe we should do a gout episode.
We said that. I was listening today. 'Cause I'm trying to listen to our things now to remind us what we've said.
We're going to do this. Totally forgotten.
Yes, we should jot it down. I was listening to the Patreon episodes on Mehmed. I'd forgotten how fascinating he was. I'd forgotten all the good things. I just remembered he was the baddie that
Everybody was afraid of.
got Constantinople.
Yes.
But there was an awful lot more to him than that. And in that episode, we did say we were going to look at gout. So, right, jot it down.
Okay.
Another thing that was troubling him was not his conscience, far from it. It was the thought that he should have arrived back triumphant.
Okay.
And yet here he was, trailing across the country, having to justify himself to the sovereigns again.
Right.
He wrote to them, quote, I discovered for you 333 leagues of mainland at the very end of the Orient, named 700 islands in addition to what I discovered on the first voyage, and I pacified for you the island of Hispaniola, which is larger than Spain, and inhabited by innumerable people, unquote.
Pacified.
Well, not quite as innumerable as they have been.
Pacified.
Pacified, yes. He said he was only being criticised because, quote, I had not sent back ships right away laden with gold, unquote.
That's not the only reason you're being criticised there, buddy.
I honestly think that that's...
Do you think he believes his statement?
I think he believes it. I think he's managed to justify it in his own mind that everybody's against him, they're xenophobic.
Those are the worst people.
Yeah.
You can never get them to understand that what they've done is wrong. Drives me nuts.
Maybe it's the only way to do it, because if you believed it was wrong, you'd feel guilty.
You should feel guilty.
And guilt's not a very pleasurable feeling, is it?
Human atrocities.
Yeah.
Not even misdemeanors. We're talking about atrocities. That's a horrible word, and you did them all.
Yeah. Yeah, he reminded them, I brought you enough samples of gold and told you about the existence of the gold mines. And very large nuggets, and also copper, and I delivered to you so many kinds of spices that it would be too long to write it down. I wondered perhaps he couldn't spell rhubarb, that's why he couldn't write it down. And yet all this made no difference to some people, unquote. Yeah. And all this talk of gold sounded a bit hollow when a goldsmith tested the gold nuggets that Columbus had brought back and said they were just an alloy.
Oh!
Not solid gold.
Not pure gold.
Well, this is, again, an insight into his mind. He refused to believe it. Despite the fact the man's a goldsmith, he presumably knows what he's talking about.
Dear. I'm actually picturing Trump saying, I know this better than anybody, and then totally disregarding the science.
I'm clever, you're dumb.
Yeah.
Yes. I was getting intimations of Trump all the way through this. He did have a huge chip on his shoulder, Columbus. I mean, not Trump. I'm sure Trump does as well. But for all his claims of nobility, which I think he was trying, he married into the nobility. I think he sort of pushed that.
Oh, that poor woman. Well, he's gone most of the time, so she's okay.
Well, she's either dead or he'd left. I don't know. But Oviedo said he was sending... Oviedo was the historian for Ferdinand and Isabella, said he was sending money back to his impoverished father. So it seems that everybody knew where he'd come from. They didn't... No one was fooled.
Oh.
Columbus may have thought that he'd been hard done by, not to be greeted as a hero, but most of us would think he got away very lightly.
Yeah, I think you should be in the stocks.
Well, Ferdinand and Isabella did agree to the third voyage.
Why?
I don't know why, especially since the man's ill. He's really very ill. Group of ships left Spain in February 1497, but without Columbus, because he was organising the manning and provisioning of the rest of the fleet. And the manning took quite some time, since men now knew what to expect.
Yeah, you're going to die. He might leave you there so he can bring back stuff. You'll die then. How would you go?
Yes, it's not going to be the quick dash to the New World, fill your pockets with gold and come home. You could expect months, if not years, of hardship. And strangely, this didn't appeal to most people. Ferdinand and Isabella were offering good terms.
You'd have to.
30 maravedis a day for sailors and 6,000 maravedis for those who were prepared to stay and work on the land. And apparently that's good. I mean, I'm not an expert on Spanish currency, but women were also allowed on this voyage.
Oh, poor women.
But despite that, it was still hard to recruit. So a decree was issued that stated that criminals who agreed to go would get their sentence reduced. This didn't apply to people convicted of murder, treason, sodomy, arson, or counterfeiting. But in the last voyage, if you remember, the criminals would have to stay forever. They were being transported out there. But
it boggles the mind that sodomy is on a level with murder.
Yeah. Yep. Well, they're all capital offences, I suppose, aren't they?
That's not a capital offence.
Yes, it is. Yes, it was.
Yeah, I know.
But this time, the criminals being offered a trip to the New World in exchange for a reduced sentence. But this is hardly the crack team that Columbus was hoping for, I don't think. Very reluctant criminals. well, probably quite happy to be criminals, but reluctant sailors.
And how does Isabella honestly think that criminals are going to be the ones to treat her new subjects gently?
I think there's a sense of desperation now. Just, we need whoever we can get. People don't want to go. It didn't help, really, that we've seen how reluctant Ferdinand was to hand over money. So, and Columbus wasn't the only one anymore. They were issuing exploration rights to other captains.
Oh, dear.
And then Columbus got in a brawl with a representative of a bishop who mocked the venture once too often. Oh. So you get the impression that Columbus's nerves are on a knife edge. You think he's a very testy man anyway.
But he still manages to get everything. It's like Ayala. Somewhere in there, you have to have this insane charisma that you can turn on in order to continue to get money for these voyages.
He was described as being, when he needed to, could be very charming.
Sociopath. Is that the right one? I never know which one's the right one.
Any sort of path will do, I think. Well, he set sail June 1947. No, he didn't. He set sail June 1497. He set a course further south than he had previously, since it was widely believed that the closer you went to the equator, the more precious stuff there was.
Yeah, because it's been built in the heat.
Yeah, Pliny the Elder's theory. And God knows he needed to find something. I think that's
Anything.
what he was thinking. Yeah. They suffered terribly from the heat and were stuck for 8 days with no wind. Eventually they spotted an island with 3 peaks, so Columbus called it Trinidad.
Ah, Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, it's one of the few places that he named that are still got the name that he gave them.
Interesting.
What are you doing? He was so convinced they must be in China now that when a group of canoes arrived, clearly not carrying Chinese people, he just sent them away.
You're not what we're looking for. Get out.
Yes. If you're not Chinese, then bog off. We don't need you. They left Trinidad and sailed on, but then they spotted a landmass that they initially took to be another island, but in fact they were in the mouth of the Orinoco between Brazil and Venezuela.
Oh,
so at last
South
they had
America.
struck the mainland, yeah. And he could tell it was the mainland by the topography.
Okay.
On August the 2nd, they moored up. Some of the locals turned up in a canoe, but they couldn't be enticed to come closer, even with shiny, shiny things.
I wonder if word has gotten around.
I wonder. So Columbus improvised a dance.
Okay.
He got a tambourine and he and some of his men danced to show that they came in peace.
They're insane.
Yes. I think I haven't seen any films about Columbus, but I really hope that this scene is in it, if there are any. I can imagine him being a rather sort of lugubrious dancer as well. I don't think he'd be very flamboyant, reluctant dancer. But it turned out to be a really stupid idea because who would have thought? The Indians thought it was a war dance and prepared for battle.
Oh!
Yeah. They shot arrows, the Spanish got out the guns, and it was only stopped by a brave pilot who dodged the arrows and got in a canoe with a pile of clothes which he offered to the Indians. And they accepted and asked him to come ashore where they gave him gifts. So these things flare up from peace to war and war to peace
So quickly.
very quickly in these things. Their leader turned up wearing a gold crown, which he placed on Columbus's head.
Oh!
And I think that was the very worst thing he could have done.
Yes.
Because immediately dollar signs ka-chinged in the sailors' eyes.
And now he has more than a sample to take to Isabella and Ferdinand.
The heads of the Indians were bound in cloth, and Columbus recorded in his log that they were wearing turbans. Because, of course, they were. That's what Marco Polo said they wore in China.
Right.
So, unfortunately for Columbus, his inflamed eyes meant he couldn't go ashore at this point. So it was a mere minion, Pedro de Terreros, who actually claimed the continent of America for Ferdinand and Isabella. So Columbus didn't get to claim it, he didn't get to name it, really. After all his plans. This was more like his first voyage. You remember the first voyage was a lot more gentle than the second, relatively speaking. Columbus marvelled at everything he saw, and he treated the Indians with interest rather than weighing them up as potential slaves.
Wow.
He also seems to be thinking of his men a bit more, because he didn't want to have to go back to Spain for another slap on the wrist, even if it was more of a tickle than a slap this time. His entries in his logbook become almost poetic. He described the sky as mild and conducive to stargazing. And stargazing doesn't sound like using the stars for navigation. It sounds more like introspection.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this introspective stargazing led him to one of the most ridiculous navigational errors he would make. Instead of realising he was off the coast of South America, he went even further than believing that he was in China. He thought he'd found the entrance to paradise. And that's not figuratively speaking. That's
Eden?
not thinking, it is so lovely, it feels like entering paradise. He thinks this is the entrance to paradise.
Oh.
And it was at this point that he claimed that the world wasn't round, but it was pear-shaped. Quote, which is round everywhere except at the stalk, where it juts out a long way like a woman's nipple, unquote.
Why not stick with like the stem?
He's been at sea too long.
What the heck?
He got this idea from a strange feeling he got when he was 100 leagues west of the Azores, that he was sailing uphill. And at the top of the hill, the top of this nipple, was paradise.
And every guy there is like, what? He's the one we're following?
I was wondering if this life that Columbus had been living for the last 8 years was actually conducive to sanity.
No.
It's not a normal way to live. The lack of sleep and food,
Yeah.
the strain of commanding mutinous men, the constant fear of shipwreck or attack, the fear of what would greet him when he got back to Spain,
Yeah.
giving his sense of a man of destiny a bit of a knock, the misery he'd caused everywhere he went, his inability to find gold in the quantities he felt would give him the kudos he craved, his failing health, the constant pain in his eyes and joints. It was hardly surprising he was becoming a little
Unhinged.
fanciful, I was going for. He started to see everything they came across as a coded message from God. That's not a good sign, is it?
No, it's not.
He started making statements that he, of all people, would know were completely false. Quote, the world is small, 6 parts are dry, and only the 7th is covered in water. Experience has already verified that, unquote. In fact, his whole life had verified completely the opposite.
Yeah.
He must know how much sea there is. But he still had his head turned by gold and pearls.
Well, wouldn't he, though? Because that's what Isabella and Ferdinand are demanding.
I assume they're demanding that.
Well, that was the
I've
whole...
not had...
Wasn't
Yeah,
the
I mean, the idea is that they should claim the land and convert the people.
Right.
I think the gold would be nice too, I think. They wouldn't turn it down. This is another of his moments of divergence from reality. And it's probably something that he'd read in Pliny the Elder. Clever man, fascinating book, but I should think you shouldn't take the information at face value in that book. Pliny believed that pearls were made from dew, which got into the oyster when the shell was open. So the greater the dew, the bigger the pearls.
Oh, okay.
The fact that Columbus said he needed his cloak in the morning implies that the area had a lot of dew, and therefore massive pearls. So, it stands to reason that's
Okay.
what he was hoping.
Somebody obviously had been harvesting pearls. Wouldn't they know that had nothing to do with dew?
You'd think so.
Yeah. I can't.
But then how would they think it was formed? Would they know it was formed around a nugget of dust?
Well, even if they don't know that it's formed around a nugget of dust, clams are nowhere near where dew would settle. They're in the water.
They're in the water.
Like this
I was thinking.
no
it makes
logic.
very little.
I
little
don't
difference.
understand. That has to be
I
one of
remember
the...
reading that in Pliny and thinking, yeah, I can see the problem here.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, these things get passed down over the generations and...
And somebody
to do with
doesn't say,
dew.
wait a second.
Yes. Hang on.
Yeah.
He did get something right, though, finally, and it's a big thing. Quote, I have come to believe that this is a mighty continent that was hitherto unknown, unquote.
Oh.
So I'm on page 58 of my notes, and he's finally twigged,
Wait a
hang
second.
on,
This
this isn't China. However, by this time, his eyes were so bad that he had to rely on reports from his men, which he wrote in his logbook. His eyes were hurting too much for him to look at these things himself.
What was wrong with him?
When he arrived back at the settlement, built by his brother Bartholomew, he found it in complete revolt. Mind you, he had been away for over a year, but he came back to complete mayhem. He had left 2 people in charge, which I suppose is sensible, because, life expectancy might not be great.
Yeah.
His brother Bartholomew was the governor of the colony, and Francisco Roldan was the mayor.
Okay.
But both felt that their position was the higher one.
Uh-oh.
This is something that he ought to have sorted out before he left, I think.
Yeah.
Roldan began to get delusions of grandeur. Bartholomew had to head off to quell an uprising, leaving his brother Diego in charge, and Roldan immediately said that he and some others were going to commandeer a ship and sail back to Spain to tell Ferdinand and Isabella how corrupt the Columbus brothers were. And Diego obviously said, you'll do no such thing. But Roldan was able to spread
Distension?
Roldan was able to spread dissension. Columbus is never coming back with the supplies.
Yeah.
He's left you here to die. He doesn't care about you. And what Roldan proposed was that they should divide all the wealth of the island amongst them all. And if you think he had the moral high ground because he wants to accuse Columbus of corruption, no. He thought they should be able to use the Indians as they pleased without any interference from anybody.
Oh.
He wasn't complaining about the treatment of the Indians, but of the Spanish, and particularly him. And it wasn't hard to turn the men, given how badly they had been treated by Columbus. I'm amazed this didn't happen years ago.
Yes.
Or ages ago.
Yeah.
The plan was to kill Bartholomew when he got back from his trip. I'm not sure why they didn't kill Diego, but they didn't. And I'm not sure what went wrong, but somehow Bartholomew must have taken the wind out of Roldan's sails, since it culminated with Roldan storming off.
Oh.
And he had said he wanted to return to Spain, but Bartholomew told him he wouldn't be able to do it. He might be able to launch a ship, but neither he nor any of his followers had the skill to navigate to Spain.
Ah.
And Roldan said, can so too. But it turned out they couldn't. They couldn't even launch the ship. So they ransacked. That must have been humiliating. Everybody's standing there watching them.
What do you do? How do we do this? Is there something holding us here?
Yeah. Try putting on that rope.
Yeah.
No, that's worse.
Yeah. Oh,
hang on. That's all fallen down. Oh
gosh. The main mast's in the water. We're screwed.
Yeah, it's like if somebody's trying to do a bit of tight parking, immediately a crowd comes and stands around.
There's actually like this YouTube video of these guys that all they do is go down to a boat dock and rate and cheer on people as they're trying to launch their boats into the water, and people get so mad.
Well, they couldn't do it, so they ransacked it instead, including taking the weapons. It might not have been the pushover that Roldan was expecting, but it's interesting that there seemed to be nothing that Bartholomew could do to stop him.
Yeah.
I mean, he stopped himself through incompetence, but that was just lucky. Roldan and his men set off through the jungle, telling anyone who would listen that the Columbuses were destroying the Indians with their tithes and tributes, but that he, Roldan, was the champion of the Indians.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, this is because he suddenly realised that he would need the Indians.
Yeah.
He couldn't do this without their support.
And then afterwards we'll re-enslave you.
Yeah. He made a pact with a group of Indians to attack the rest of the Spanish. I mean, that's quite a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's a bit like the Buckingham Rebellion, because someone jumped in prematurely and the whole thing is a bit of a disaster. But to show how far Roldan had gone down this path, 2 Spanish ships were seen approaching, and Roldan's plan was to capture them and steal all the stuff. Luckily for Bartholomew, he was closer to the port, so there's a lot to be said for just getting there first. But this is effectively civil war.
Yeah.
Just 6 years after the first landing. There then came a battle of words, with each side threatening to go back to Spain and tell Ferdinand and Isabella
I'm
the
going to be
atrocities
sound
of the
like
other.
little kids.
They do, and I bet Bartholomew was saying, yeah, go back to Spain. Yeah, we've seen how well you do at it. Go on, we could do with a good laugh. So Columbus returned from Spain to this mess. He wrote Roldan a letter saying that he felt their pain and couldn't they just let bygones be bygones. And he granted a general pardon to all and offered them safe passage. But I think Bartholomew had said, look, we're in a real bind here. We've not got the people.
No.
But Roldan refused. He had Columbus in the hollow of his hand, he said, and he could help him or crush him as he chose. And it turned out he could, because Columbus capitulated.
Really?
Yeah, too many of the Columbus's men were going over to Roldan's side, until Columbus only had 70 men.
Oh.
If you think Roldan went off with 400.
Oh.
And then Columbus said he'd give a favourable report to Ferdinand and Isabella, and Roldan agreed to stand down. It's as though these people take it to the brink and then panic.
This is going to get bloody.
Yeah, what have I done? Whatever Columbus had said about what he'd tell Ferdinand and Isabella, in fact, he'd already sent them a letter telling them, quote, of the damage they had done and were continuing to do on the island, plundering and acting violently, killing whomever they please for no reason at all, taking other men's wives and daughters, and perpetrating many other evil deeds, unquote.
That you were doing that?
Yes. Yes.
Hello, pot. I am the kettle.
Yeah. He asked Ferdinand and Isabella to send devout religious men to replace the sinners. But the trouble was, devout religious men didn't want to go.
No, and the sinners are there because you chose to take criminals.
Yes. Well, I suppose I don't know what Roldan's history was, whether he was a criminal, but and if these devout religious men did go, they were very shocked by what they found, as we'll find out in De Las Casas' episode. It's they get there and say, "What the hell are you up to?
What is going on?"
Columbus carried on, quote, all the people importuned me, saying that they would serve me well and better than anybody. But it was the reverse, because they only came believing that the golden spices that were said to be found could be gathered with shovels, and that the spices already came tied in bundles on the seashore, so there was nothing more to do than to throw them into the ships. They were blinded by greed, unquote.
And you're not. Well, I guess he's more blinded by status, but still.
Yeah. And that is what Bartolomé de las Casas, amongst others, said of him. He said they hated him because of this, but it's partially true, but also it's true that he was treating them badly, keeping them on short rations.
Yep.
That was why they hated him. Yep. He wasn't endearing himself to his own men.
Nope.
Columbus gave Roldan an estate to shut him up. I mean, you can give away what you like, can't you?
Yeah, if you own the whole thing.
Somebody else's land. 2 cows, 2 bulls, 2 mares, and 20 sows. As Las Casas said, quote, he did not dare deny him anything, unquote.
Wow.
I mean, if Roldan and his men decided to do it, they could have just stormed, Santa Diego, and killed everybody.
Yeah.
So, although Columbus discovered, or felt he'd discovered, the Indies, Roldan had stepped in and almost taken it from him.
Yes.
And Columbus said that it was the thought of how upset Ferdinand and Isabella would be that upset him most.
Liar.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to be that bothered who's running the place,
Nope.
frankly. But then, in November 1498, an agreement was drawn up which allowed Roldan and his men to go back to Spain without a stain on their character. Although obviously preceded by that letter that Columbus had already sent, so they might have an interesting reception.
He's just not saying anything.
They would be provisioned for the journey. They could take slaves, wives, in inverted commas. Ugh. And several set off, but not Roldan because, why would he? He's just been given an estate.
Yeah.
But they were caught in a storm and had to make harbour. And then they refused to go any further, saying that the agreement was null and void because Columbus had delayed the ship. Well, he might have become quite a religious nut by this point, but even he didn't think he could whip up a storm. It must have been so frustrating for Columbus because he thought, oh, God, they're going, and waving them goodbye. Go on, don't come back. And then, 5 minutes later, they turn up again. Well, Columbus seems to have upped the ante now because one of the rebels was hanged for treason.
Oh.
He was a high-born man, which caused great consternation, even in the Columbus encampment.
Oh, dear.
Well, Columbus did an Elizabeth, Mary Queen of Scots thing and said, it had all happened so quickly. If only I'd known, I'd put a stop to it. But the buck stops with him. I mean,
yep. Just like with Elizabeth, nobody believed her.
No. And then Roldan did a tit for tat and tried some of Columbus's men for treason. And then what should come over the horizon but 4 ships from Spain? And they hadn't been expected, so who could they be? Thought maybe Ferdinand had got Columbus's letter and sent help, sent all those lovely devout religious people.
Or sent people to get you out of there.
Well, to Columbus's annoyance, it was Ojeda, his rival from the previous voyage.
Oh.
He had been sent by Ferdinand and Isabella, and that meant they commissioned Ojeda to do the trip, so Columbus was no longer having the monopoly of the Indies. Most annoyingly, since very few of Columbus's place names caught on, Ojeda arrived, landed, said, this is a bit like Venice. I'll call it Little Venice, Venezuela.
And it stuck.
Yeah, you're probably thinking, who the hell are you to come here and start naming things? And then Vinte Yanez Pinzon, who had sailed on Columbus's first voyage, landed in Brazil. So Columbus is being left behind. All these discoveries are being made. And I can call them discoveries because, they went there and thought, wow, this is an amazing place. That's a discovery. They didn't invent the place like they seem to make out they did.
Yeah.
But the trouble was that people were beginning to realise, actually, this crossing the Atlantic malarkey, it's not so very difficult, is it? In a way, it's got to be easier than crossing the English Channel, I think. Ojeda brought with him an obscure Florentine called Amerigo Vespucci, talking of names that caught on.
Ah, yes.
Lacasa said that Vespucci was a great fraud, so maybe we'll do an episode on him, maybe for Patreon if people vote for him, because I'd like to know why he's a great fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Ojeda somehow managed to oust Roldan and turn Columbus's men away from him, Roldan. But not back to Columbus, to Ojeda. So it's almost as if Columbus doesn't exist anymore, he's piggy in the middle. And Ojeda was a great stirrer. He told Roldan's men that Ferdinand and Isabella had sent him over to make sure that Columbus paid their wages, but Columbus had refused, because that's the sort of cad he is.
Oh, how lovely.
Ojeda said that what they ought to do is storm Santo Domingo and get their wages back.
Oh.
Then they could throw Columbus off the island. And all that talk about, we haven't found much gold yet, it's all lies, he said. They had found tons of gold, but Columbus was hiding it from Ferdinand and Isabella and his men.
Oh, dear.
Maybe that was Ojeda stirring, or maybe it was the story that was doing the rounds back in Spain. Other people are finding gold. What are you doing with your gold? They did attack Santo Domingo, leading to injuries and deaths on both sides. And then the men became somehow convinced that Roldan had betrayed them. No doubt Ojeda had been stirring again. And so they turned on him. So it just seems to be a free-for-all. And soon Ojeda was being told to leave by Roldan, and he agreed.
Oh.
Because he was worried that word would get back to Ferdinand and Isabella and he'd lose the moral high ground. They're all thoroughly bad people.
Yes.
Trying to do a bit of power politics.
Yes. And
it keeps backfiring.
At it.
And it's hard to know what Columbus was doing while all this was going on. I got the feeling he was keeping out of it and hoping that Roldan and Ojeda would sort of end up neutralising each other, shall we say.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Go get him. And I'm thinking of Australia. We'll bring in these, and then we'll bring in this animal to kill that animal, and then we'll bring in this animal to kill that animal. Doesn't get better.
No. February 1500. Columbus planned to sail back to Spain. His son Ferdinand said that the people had been sending messages back to Spain, conveying what he called false information, fake news, about him and his brothers. It was all xenophobia, he said. It's because they weren't Spanish. That's what it all boiled down to. And there was even a rumour that Columbus might side with a foreign power who would allow him to run the Indies as he saw fit.
Oh.
Probably Portugal, I
suppose. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And back in Spain, discontented mariners were waylaying King Ferdinand and shouting, "Give us our pay," at him.
Oh.
Because they'd been reduced to poverty because they hadn't received their wages from Columbus. And that's not the sort of thing that's going to endear Columbus to the monarchs.
No.
They're probably thinking, "Oh, I've got to put up with this because of him."
Yep.
And if Columbus's son Ferdinand had to go back in disguise because he was afraid of being mobbed.
Oh, yeah, that's a good indication that they're not happy with you.
Yeah. Ferdinand and Isabella had had enough. They appointed Francisco de Bobadilla, and he was a member of the military wing of the Cistercian order, which is a job that really shouldn't exist, I don't think. The name Bobadilla rang a bell. It was Beatrix Bobadilla who fell for Columbus and tried to keep him with her on her island. And he was quite tempted, even though she'd seemed to have got through quite a lot of husbands already. We heard about in the first episode. The monarchs gave this Bobadilla the title of Governor of the Islands and Mainland of the Indies. So if he was going to investigate Columbus, he had every incentive to find him guilty as charged and get him out of the way so that he could take over. Not an ideal situation to have a judge and jury that actually benefits from somebody being found guilty.
No. If I were Ferdinand and Isabella, I'd order everybody back and start over again. Because nothing's getting fixed this way. There is a point in time where you have to say, okay, stop. Like, take it all apart. Start at the beginning.
Yeah, if they'd only done it in this early stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because everyone who comes back says, "Oh, well, Columbus is terrible.
Yeah.
He's made a mess of it. He's causing atrocities." And then Columbus comes back and says, "Well, it wasn't me. It was Ojeda."
Yeah.
And then Ojeda comes back and says, "No, it was Columbus and Roldan." And Roldan comes back and
Yeah.
says, "No, it was Columbus." And
like I said, scrap them all. Start with somebody fresh.
You'd think that they would be thinking, "Well, you all sound awful."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every single one of you.
Yeah, well, sadly, that's not how things happen, is it?
No, I guess not.
Roldan had stopped the tribute that the native people had to pay so as to endear himself so they'd fight against Columbus. Columbus now reinstated the tribute. And he was in a catch-22 situation. He needed the money from the tribute to pay Ferdinand and Isabella back for financing the voyage. And that must have endeared him to the natives as well. "I need the money because I need to pay for my trip here." And you think, "I didn't want you to come here." But the tributes were causing the Indians to rise up against him, which he was then having to quell, which giving more grist to the mill of his detractors, saying how cruelly he was treating the Indians. And it was causing the Indians to rise up against him. It's just a mess.
It's a complete and utter.
Sunday, August the 23rd, Bobadilla appeared in the harbour of Santo Domingo. Only Diego Columbus was there, and Bobadilla said he was there to put down rebellions, but Diego said, "It's all okay, it's all in hand. Executed several rebels just this week."
Oh!
Yeah, and Christopher Columbus was in Jaragua, organising more executions.
Oh, gosh.
I don't know what stories had got back to Spain, but Bobadilla was horrified when he heard that the executions were Spaniards. This hadn't occurred to him.
They were okay that they were Indians.
Well, yeah, I suppose if you think, well, there's a civil war going on, you'd assume it was the Spanish against the Indians. And there were still 2 Spaniards hanging there.
Okay, first off, this is not a civil war, idiot. You were conquering somewhere. That's not a civil war.
Yeah, and all that great talk about this amazing capital city, the wide central street, substantial housing, magnificence enough to reflect the splendour of the Spanish court,
Oh, really?
deflecting the river and putting in watermills. It was shown to be a sham.
Yep.
The buildings were already dilapidated. They were already rotting. And they were infested with mosquitoes and snakes, so nobody wanted to be in them. The men stayed on the ships. The whole thing was just squalid and grim. The native villages, by contrast, were pictures of order and craftsmanship and agriculture. The superior culture of Spain was hardly being shown off to advantage here. Because Columbus wasn't there, why would they be? They hadn't been expecting visitors. Bobadilla decided that he had abdicated and renounced his role as governor. So Bobadilla moved into his premises and took over. And he confiscated all Columbus's stuff, including all his papers that he'd amassed to defend his reputation when he got back to Spain.
All the lies. I have your lies right here.
Well, Columbus had been in contact with one of Queen Isabella's close associates, close friends, Juana de la Torre. I don't know how he met her or what the circumstances of this relationship is, but to her he wrote, quote, "Consider, your grace, what one who held my position was to think. Honours and favours for those who sought to usurp their majesty's authority and who have done so much harm and damage. Humiliation for one who has sustained it through so many perils," unquote. And that's really how it seems to him. You know, I've done nothing.
I've done
And
nothing.
yet-
It wasn't me.
Yes. And yet I just keep getting told off about it, and everybody else gets away with it. I just don't understand it. Bobadilla made a start at ruling his new domain. He suspended tribute for 20 years. And he also got Christopher Columbus to come to him. When he arrived, both Columbus and his brother Diego were put in chains.
Ooh.
Columbus justified himself, quote, "I have brought under the dominion of the king and queen another world, whereby Spain, which was called poor, is now most rich," unquote. Well, rich in slaves, not in gold. He was brought before Bobadilla in what was commonly seen as a farcical and highly prejudiced trial. Later, even Ferdinand and Isabella would admit they'd made a mistake in sending Bobadilla.
But they won't admit that they made a mistake with Columbus.
No, I don't think they do.
I don't think they
I'm trying
do
to think
either.
If they ever do, no. If he finds him innocent, Bobadilla's got to go home and say, no, apparently he's all right. But if he finds him guilty, he gets to take over. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion.
Yes. Very fair trial. Not that I'm upset about it.
No, well, the witness statements were pretty damning.
Yeah.
He wouldn't allow Indians to be converted to Christianity unless he gave permission.
What?
Since he said they all belonged to him.
Oh, that'll make you a friend of Isabella.
Well, I did wonder, this one does sound as if it was made specially for her, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Then he ordered dozens of Spaniards to be whipped in public because they'd given gold for a bit of food because they were starving. A woman's tongue was cut out because she criticised Columbus.
Oh my goodness.
In fact,
did that actually happen? We don't know.
We have no way of telling. I mean, she said his father was a weaver, which he was.
I'm a weaver. I'm a weaver.
Well, apparently you're the lowest of the low.
I looked to my right at Elizabeth, my loom. Like, we are poor.
The main component was incompetent governance. There's no possible reason why his men should be starving. Yet Columbus preferred to keep the food rotting in the holds of the ship rather than to hand it out. I don't know. That sounds as if it might well be true, but it also sounds like the sort of things that you'd accuse somebody of. I just don't know.
Yeah.
As the ships taking the Columbus brothers away to Spain pulled out of the harbour, there was general rejoicing.
Yeah. No kidding. Thank God.
Columbus and his brothers were kept in fetters for the entire journey.
That can't be comfortable.
Even Las Casas, who devoted his life to criticising Columbus, was shocked by his treatment. You know, he might have been a monster without a conscience, but he was still the governor. You don't put the governor in chains.
I don't have a problem with this.
Well, the captain did offer to remove the fetters, but Columbus, playing the martyr, and obviously thinking that this would go down very well at his hearing, refused, saying that the monarchs had said they should go on, so they're staying on.
Oh.
But this was such a shocking time for Columbus, and one he would never forget, that he told his son that he wanted to be buried with his chains.
I wonder if that happened.
I'm not sure. His body did a lot of travelling post-death.
Oh.
But
did it?
But he did milk these chains for all they were worth. When he reached Cadiz and the manacles were removed, he took to wearing a Franciscan habit with extra short sleeves. So everyone would see the marks on his wrists.
Oh.
Yeah.
He's very good at, public manipulation.
He is, and this sort of thing went down well.
Yeah.
They think medieval Catholic, exhibition of wounds show piety, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I know flagellation wasn't supposed to be done, but people did respect them.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose it's equivalent of wearing a big bandage on his ear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ferdinand and Isabella called the Columbus brothers to the court, and they stressed that the chaining was nothing to do with them. It was Bobadilla exceeding his remit. Columbus was probably kicking himself then, thinking, damn, I could have taken the damn things off. He knelt down before them and burst into tears. He said, tears were quite much more common in those days, weren't they?
I know, but it is, again, you're manipulating them. They aren't real. Crocodile tears.
Yeah.
That's an interesting
He said that much of what Bobadilla had accused him of was true, but it had been done through zeal, not malice. He then talked about the humiliation of being shackled and begged forgiveness, and he must have put on a very good performance, since Ferdinand and Isabella gave him back all his rights and privileges and issued an order to Bobadilla to give back Columbus's stuff.
I want to rip out my hair. Like, come on, don't be so dumb.
He's very good at it. You'd think he'd be pleased with that. But instead, he wrote something called the Book of Privileges, in which he wrote everything down that he felt he was still owed. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella seem to have had enough of him by this point. Although they allowed him to keep his titles, Admiral and Viceroy, he was no longer actual Admiral or Viceroy of anything.
Okay.
Another man, Nicholas de Ovando, would rule Hispaniola instead. And I'm sure they probably sugarcoated it, saying that Columbus was not as young as he had been, and he was practically blind, he was crippled with arthritis, his mental health wasn't great, he was having huge mood swings. They probably said to him, wouldn't you rather put your feet up?
Yeah, it's time for you to retire.
Yes, potter about at home for a while. Take up bowls, yeah. Meanwhile, Bobadilla was heading home. On board, he had Roldan and Guarionex, an Indian who had led an uprising. They had no sooner left when a hurricane hit. It blew the city of Santo Domingo to pieces. I mean, it was in fairly shoddy shape already, but it just collapsed. And it blew most of the ships to pieces. All but one sank. Bobadilla, Roldan and Guarionex were all drowned. And I can't help wondering, when Columbus heard about that, whether he thought that was the hand of God.
Yeah, I was just going to say. How frustrating this has been.
Voyage number 4. This is 1502 to 1504. And Columbus's 13-year-old son Ferdinand accompanied him on the fourth trip.
13?
13?
He's taking him at 13 to witness all of these atrocities. Well, that's a great parenting thing to do.
Well, he does regret it, but that's not because of atrocities. It's just this trip does not go well.
None of them have gone well.
This trip is truly a utter disaster. And he keeps thinking, why did I bring him? Why did I bring him? And it seems astonishing, given that everything that's happened, that there should be a fourth voyage.
Yeah, I'm not... Yeah,
I mean, you can see it from Columbus's point of view, because he's no one in Spain. He's got no reason to stay in Spain. But in the New World... he's somebody.
Yeah.
They don't like him. Nobody likes him.
But he's in power. Nobody likes anybody in power. It's fine. God has placed me here. This is where I'm meant to be. This is my destiny.
This is my destiny, yes. You feel he's got some power ballad that he keeps going into. The amazing thing is that Ferdinand and Isabella agreed, unless they just got fed up with him and thought, just go.
Just go. Get out of our faces. We never want to see you again. Maybe you won't come back.
Well, he's 51.
Yeah.
Which is not bad going for this time. And he's added malaria to his list of ills.
Oh. I don't know why I said oh. He deserves it.
Well, while in Spain, he'd gone on retreat to a Carthusian monastery where he stayed in a cell alone, his food being delivered by a turntable in the door.
Was this for mental health reasons?
I should imagine after spending
his wife
so many months cooped up in a tiny ship with other evil-smelling men, it was probably quite nice to get a bit of me time.
Yeah.
And he wrote his book of prophecies, which was a collection of, quote, sources, statements, opinions and prophecies on the subject of the recovery of God's holy city and Mount Zion, and on the discovery and evangelization of the island of the Indies and of all other people and nations, unquote.
Wow.
And in this book he recounts his reason for going to the New World as having been directed there by God. No mention of gold, spice, pearls, no mention of wanting to be viceroy, just God. Mm-hmm. He said that everything he'd done up to now, all the things he'd been criticised for and kept in chains for, had been done as part of a grand plan. Oh, and it was 150 years till the end of the world.
Oh!
I don't know why he chose 150. That puts us into 1650, which in England you might have thought probably was the end of the world because it's bang splat in the middle of the Civil War. So.
Yeah, but geez, like he's really gone off the deep end.
Yeah.
Like that sounds beyond unreasonable for sure.
Yeah, I mean, less so now because, 1500, there was a lot of end of the world stuff going around, wasn't there?
It's like the 80s and 70s. You remember seeing people on the news, the end is nigh, carrying their little billboards. They sort of disappeared.
Yeah, I haven't seen, I've got to say, I haven't seen one of those for ages. But no, I haven't been in London for ages to see them wandering around. They might still be there.
I haven't seen any. And they haven't been on the news.
No.
Wonder what happened.
Well, I guess the end isn't nigh.
No, nowhere near.
Excellent.
Seems to come in waves.
Yeah. On this last voyage, Columbus was not the captain of the flagship. And this was not necessarily signalling a lot of trust in him and his abilities. It was the fear that with his gout, arthritis, failing vision, and now malaria, he might not be able to manage the physical stresses of leadership.
Right.
It turned out to be a good move, actually. It's extraordinary that they took him along at all, really, isn't it? He's in a really bad way.
Because somebody's going to be caring for him.
It's funny you should say that. Yes.
Oh. Is that why he brought his 13-year-old son along?
Probably not why he brought him, but it's probably just as well he did. There were just 4 ships on this one. The second voyage was his big one. It seems to be, very much an afterthought, this one. Columbus was in charge of navigation. He got them to Martinique, which must be very nice. And Las Casas is on this voyage, so he got to see everything firsthand. And he wrote a lot on this subject, which we'll see in his episode. When they arrived at Santo Domingo, which presumably they'd sort of propped up again, I'm not sure, the new governor, Ovando's heart must have sank when he saw it's no other person than Columbus.
Not again.
Yeah, he'd been pointing out his shortcomings and complaining about his behaviour, so he must have been absolutely amazed to see him back.
What are you doing here?
In fact, he banned him from coming back. Never darken our doorstep again.
Hello.
And yet, June 29th, 1502, there he was. And Columbus sent a message to Ovando saying that he needed shelter from an oncoming storm, since one of those ships was in urgent need of repair. And actually, by a strange twist of time, this is the very same storm that sank all but one of Bobadilla's ships.
Really?
So Bobadilla was on his way out, and Columbus was on his way in.
But Columbus made it and he didn't.
Yes. Well.
Okay.
Who is Columbus?
Oh yeah, God's messenger.
Yes, he's a man of destiny. Bobadilla, not a man of destiny. No. Columbus tried to warn Ovando that there was a storm at brewing, but Ovando thought this was just an excuse so that Columbus could get back to Santo Domingo. So he refused Columbus entry and, he sent the other ships off to their doom. Columbus was justifiably miffed at not being allowed safe harbour. Quote, even for the safety of myself, my son, brothers and friends, I was forbidden in such weather to put into land or enter harbours that I had gained for Spain by my own blood and sweat, unquote.
Oh my gosh.
For little Ferdinand, just 13, it was all new and exciting. They saw a manta ray, which he said was the size of a medium-sized bed, which I thought was an interesting comparison. They harpooned it and it pulled the ship along for a while, much to the excitement of the crew, but then it died.
Yeah.
He got his first taste of manatee, which he said tasted like calf, presumably veal.
Ah.
And on this journey they came across the Mayans. And Columbus knew they were a different people, and he knew that they're a more advanced civilization, so you'd think he'd wanted to get to know more about them, but he didn't for one very simple reason. Right from the first moment he'd conceived this expedition, all those years ago, he had one mission: to discover China. Ah. He was ill. He was getting on in age. He needed to get on with it. If he was going to cover China, if he didn't do it on this voyage,
but
it just wasn't going to happen.
So he knows it's not China now.
Yes. He knows he's not there.
But it's just around the corner.
You can almost see it. Just squint. There it is. Yeah. I think he probably realises it's further than he originally thought.
Oh, dear.
Because all the time he was coming across bays and things, he'd think, this must be the entrance
to China.
To China. But now, you don't get quite that feeling. He knows he's not on the cusp of China anymore. But he was very impressed by the Mayan canoes and their seamanship, and he drew alongside one canoe and traded some cotton cloths and some cacao leaves. So they were the first Europeans to come across the cacao, which was used to make the chocolate drink.
In Canada, we pronounce it cacao.
Oh, do you? It probably is cacao then.
Oh, I don't know.
I'm not sure I've ever heard it pronounced. Cacao then. Las Casas said that they asked the Mayan where the good stuff was. The gold, the spices, the pearls. But he said you couldn't trust what they said, because seeing how much pleasure their answers gave, they exaggerated what they knew, just to give more pleasure to the Spanish. That seems to have been the problem all along, really. Yeah, no, they seem to like this. Well, yes, there's lots of it.
Yes.
Next island.
Yeah, it's just over there.
Yeah, go on, knock yourself out. August 1502, they went ashore and celebrated Mass on a Honduran beach, and they claimed the land for Spain. So this is the point when Columbus himself claimed the American mainland for Spain, after several other people had been there. The going was so bad after that they barely made 70 leagues in 60 days.
Because of the weather?
The current and the wind are going against each other.
Okay.
Which is not good.
Apparently.
No. I'm not a great sailor, but he was forced to tack backwards and forwards.
Ah.
So he's doing a sort of slalom.
Yeah.
There were storms almost continuously. Columbus saw this as a trial from God, but it was more than that. For him, the weather had taken on biblical proportions. Because if you're going to do something great, you should do it against a backdrop of really impressive weather.
Yeah, like Noah.
Yeah, it's sort of pathetic fallacy. Especially since now the men were so terrified that they vowed to devote themselves to the religious life. I don't know if they did that chickpea thing again. But...
Okay, who's going to do the... Oh, nobody wants to do the... Come on, it's just a pilgrimage. It doesn't take that... Fine, we'll draw lots. We'll draw lots to see who's going to go. Somebody has to go.
Well, I'm not sure how much they remember this vow of poverty and chastity and all the rest of it when they came out the other side. This storm made Columbus most concerned for his family. His brother, who had apparently not wanted to come, I suppose his brother's getting on as well. I think it was his older brother, so he's probably thinking, I'm too old for this, Christopher, please let me stay at home. His son Diego, that he'd left back in Spain, and most of all his son Ferdinand, who was having to face these horrendous storms with him. Because he had hoped to protect his son, but he fell ill again, and as you intimated, Ferdinand had to look after him.
Oh.
And Columbus made himself more ill, worrying about what would happen to his son should he die. Young Ferdinand has quite a refreshingly matter-of-fact way of recording what he saw. Quote, a great number of Indians, many armed with bows and arrows, others with palm tree spears, black as pitch and hard as bone, and tipped with fish bones, and still others with clubs. They seemed determined to resist our landing, unquote. Yes, it's that sort of... I don't know, it's all... He's quite upbeat with everything. Yes, they really didn't want us there. And Ferdinand's description of the native people is quite different from his father's, because to him, the question is not whether they're ripe for conversion or whether they're slave material. I mean, he's 13. He's not... You know. He was more concerned that they were fascinating.
Oh.
By and large, gentle people, just as Columbus had said on his first voyage before it all went horribly wrong. The appalling weather continued, and the ships were in a bad way, because as well as being battered by storms, they were being eaten away by shipworms. When they moored close to the shore, they had to watch out for alligators. When they're at sea, they had to watch out for sharks.
Right.
The whole voyage seems horrific. And here's Columbus's description of yet another storm. Quote, "Eyes never saw the sea so rough, so ugly, and so seething with foam. The wind did not allow us to go ahead or give us a chance of running, nor did it allow us to shelter under any headland. There I was held in those seas, turned to blood, boiling like a cauldron on a mighty fire.
Oh.
The skies had never looked more threatening. For a day and a night they blazed like a furnace, and the lightning burst in such flashes that every moment I looked to see whether my mast and sails had not been struck. All the time water fell unceasingly from the sky. One cannot say it rained, for it seemed like a repetition of the deluge. The crews were now so broken that they longed for death to release them from their martyrdom." Unquote. Well, this was a man who'd spent all his life at sea, saying, "I've never seen anything like this."
So they are actually, I'm assuming, in a hurricane.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Gosh, that would have been neat to watch. From a safe spot.
Yeah, I was going to say. They're riding out yet another storm at the mouth of a river when Columbus suddenly announced he was going home. I don't know whether they just had enough or realised how ill he was or preferred to die at home. Surely no amount of gold was worth the suffering that they were going through. However, it's Brother Bartholomew, having not wanted to come, wanted to continue to hunt for treasure. And Columbus's passage home suddenly became an impossibility. Having complained of all the rain, now they became desperate for rain.
Oh.
They'd entered a river by sailing over a sandbar 4 fathoms deep,
and
so they barely made it across.
Okay.
The water suddenly dropped, and they were trapped.
Yeah.
And the tribe, who had been so friendly and helpful, had turned against them once they started trying to build a colony on their land.
Well, yeah. What the hell are you doing?
Yeah, and then some of the men had ambushed the village and taken the leader and his wives and children hostage.
Oh, yeah, that'll endear you. God, these people are dumb.
I think it was a deliberate thing because they thought, well, if we take them hostage, the people aren't going to attack us because we've got the leader.
Hostage, right. Yeah. But a lot of people think if you've got the leader, then that leader's not worth being a leader anymore.
Well, that's what happened to Moctezuma, wasn't it? Yeah. Once he was a prisoner, all respect for him had gone.
Yep.
When the rains finally came, they were able to escape the river, but they left a few men at a rudimentary settlement that they'd built.
Why?
Just a few men surrounded by a large hostile tribe. And I wonder what the men had done to deserve that honour. They were the ships of the Galliga, and the Galliga had become completely unseaworthy. They couldn't risk taking it.
So, yet again, you're being left behind because we don't have the ships.
Yes, and remembering what had happened to those 39 men he left behind last time, I thought it was quite a callous move on Columbus's part, and his men seemed to think the same.
So basically what you do at that point, decide who you hate the most and leave them behind.
Yes. The troublemakers,
yes.
The men wanted to rescue them. I mean, they were just offshore and they could see that this was, this was not great.
No.
His men were sort of saying, please don't leave us. All but one of the longboats had been lost, so Columbus was reluctant to risk losing the last by rescuing them. And back at the settlement, they managed to scare the Indians away, and they weren't likely to attack again because Columbus had the leader and his wife and children. But one night, the Spanish forgot to batten down the hatches in this fetid hold where they were keeping the hostages. So several escaped, including the leader of the tribe.
Ha-ha!
But sadly, those who didn't escape realised they'd missed their chance and hanged themselves. But with the hostages dead or escaped, there's no reason not to attack now.
Yeah.
So the situation was, Columbus and 3 ships were moored offshore, waiting out yet another storm. The crew of the Galliga were in their makeshift fort, waiting to be murdered. The crew of the other ships begged Columbus for use of the remaining longboat, at least to be able to get close enough to frighten off the Indians with musket shots. They didn't dare get any closer in case their one remaining longboat was destroyed in the waves. But they hated just sitting there while everybody else was in such danger.
Yeah.
One man jumped overboard and swam ashore to talk to the men in the fort, and the men begged to be taken onto the other ships.
That would have been risky. There are reptiles in the rivers.
Yeah, quite a brave move.
Yeah. And there's no guarantee you're getting back onto the ship. You might have just decided to stay.
Yeah, Columbus might have said, right, longboat back, and there's boat standing on the beach going, hang on,
Yeah.
what about me? But Columbus had to relent because there was talk of mutiny.
Ah, good.
Although he did point out it would risk all their lives since they were having to anchor just offshore with another storm coming. It took 2 days to ferry everyone off and all the stuff from the Galliga using the longboat and 2 canoes lashed together. And it does seem that Columbus has misread the situation if he thought he could leave the men there.
Yeah.
You know. And misreading the feeling of his crew does seem to be one of Columbus's major failings.
Yeah. One of them.
When they reached Puerto Bello, they had to abandon another ship, since it was so riddled with shipworms. The journey to Cuba was relatively uneventful by the standards of this voyage, and once there, Ferdinand tells us what happened. Quote, as we lay at anchor 10 leagues from Cuba, suffering greatly from hunger because we had nothing to eat but biscuit and a little oil and vinegar, and exhausted by working 3 pumps day and night to keep the vessels afloat, for they were ready to sink from all the holes made by the shipworms, there came on at night a great storm, in which the Bermuda, being unable to ride it out, fouled us and broke our stem, so the 2 ships at anchor bashed into each other. Nor did she get off whole, but smashed her stern into the helm, unquote. So in the middle of a storm, the crews are trying to get the 2 ships apart.
Yeah.
Before they did any more damage to each other. And these ships are straining at their anchors so much so that when the storm died down in the morning and they drew in the anchors, the one on La Capitana, Columbus's ship, had only 1 thread left on the rope.
Ooh.
So if the storm had carried on any longer, it would have snapped and they'd have ended up on the rocks. So, destiny again, you see.
Again. God saved us.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that when Ferdinand writes about these events, he refers to everybody. Quote, it pleased God to deliver us, unquote. Columbus, quote, it was the anchor and the way it held that, after God, saved me. Unquote.
Not even
me.
his son. Just me.
Me. In June, they reached Jamaica. And now the ships were taking on water so quickly that the pumps couldn't keep up, and the crew were having to bail out with saucepans and kettles. Columbus wrote, quote, I wish I'd never set out, unquote. Not only was he ill and nearly blind, he was hearing voices by this time.
Oh, that's never a good sign.
Not in a leader, definitely. When they reached a suitable place, they had to run the ships aground, since the water was up to the decks. Scary. At first they thought they were alone, and they began to panic that they'd starve to death, but then the inevitable canoes turned up with stuff to barter. Columbus kept his men on board the boats, despite the fact that the boats were on the beach, and there was a reason for this. Quote, our people, by nature, being disrespectful, no punishment or order could have stopped them from running about the country and into the Indians' hut to steal what they found and commit outrages on their wives and children.
Oh.
When would have arisen disputes and quarrels that would have made enemies of them, unquote. And Columbus has been down this path many times before. The current comment did make me wonder how much of the outrages took place with Columbus's collusion, or how much was a result of him just not being able to control his men. Just standing at the side and saying, please don't, please don't.
Yeah.
Anyway, their immediate needs had been met. The Indians had brought them food. But they were still left with a major problem. What now? They couldn't build more ships. They couldn't hope that someone would turn up and take them to safety because no one knew they were there. I'm not sure how many there were of them, but there'd been the crews of 4 ships, now crammed onto 2. Well, they could build rafts, but would they really want to be on a raft in one of those big storms?
No.
Columbus was terribly afraid that the Indians would just get fed up with them and would set the boats on fire or just stop trading with them.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea.
They were so reliant on the Indians for everything that they would have just starved. And this is extraordinary. They've been in the area long enough to know which fruits were edible.
Oh, yeah.
They're on a sea, which is
Full of fish.
famously full of fish, yes. I presume some effort must have been made to fend for themselves.
Yeah, we have to remember, it's not like now. It hasn't been overfished yet.
No.
It's still teeming with fish.
Columbus was talking over their problem with Diego Mendez, his chief clerk. And he explained that someone would have to volunteer to take a canoe to Hispaniola, buy a ship and sail it back to Jamaica and rescue them all. Mendez had quite a few qualms about this. It was phenomenally risky. But, Mendez wrote, Columbus, quote, firmly persuaded me that I was the man to undertake the voyage, unquote.
Great idea. Go ahead.
Mendez said that he feared the other men would resent the fact that he had been given this honour, and maybe they should ask around in case somebody else really fancied having this honour.
I know, it's just an idea. It's just an idea. There's got to be somebody better qualified to go.
Yeah, he was prepared, reluctantly, of course, to give it up.
Yeah.
So Columbus gathered the men and explained the plan. The men started shuffling their feet and whistling under their breath until Mendez said, Fine, I'll do it.
Fine.
Yeah. He wouldn't be going alone. About 12 Spaniards would be going with him in 2 canoes, along with Indian paddlers, despite the fact they're not the ones that are stranded. They live there. In many ways, the canoes were more seaworthy than the ships. They didn't have to bail them out all the time. But this journey was going to be 124 miles.
In a canoe.
In a canoe. Ooh. With potential storms.
Yeah. And currents. Hopefully the currents are going in the right direction. I don't think so.
Well, they set off and got as far as the east end of Jamaica when Mendez said the Indians turned nasty. Well,
yeah.
Probably not without provocation, and drew lots as to who was going to kill him.
What do you mean? Why do you have to draw lots for that?
I don't know. The Spaniards waited until the Indians were ashore and then jumped in the canoe and paddled like hell, leaving the Indians on the beach. And Columbus must have been very annoyed to see them back so soon. But soon they were off again, this time with 70 men, so presumably to outnumber the Indians. They paddled continuously for 5 days. I don't know why they didn't just get lots of canoes and take all the men, but anyway. On day 3 they ran out of food and water. They reached Hispaniola, where the plan was that Mendez should go to Santo Domingo, and the other canoe would go back to Columbus to tell him that Mendez had arrived safely and not to worry, help was on its way. Only that canoe didn't do that. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure whether they just all thought, to hell with that. I'm not going another 124 miles. Mm-hmm. I'm staying here.
I'm actually getting on a ship and going back to Spain.
Yeah. Or something happened to the canoes. But it does mean that Columbus has no idea what was happening. Back at the ships, Columbus had become yet more introspective, and yet strangely no more self-aware. He said of the islands, quote, they're in a depressed state, though they're not dying. Their illness is incurable and prolonged. Let them, who reduced them to this state, come forward with a remedy, if he can or knows how. Everyone is the master of destruction, unquote. I mean, did he include himself in this, or did he see himself as completely blameless?
Well, he's the martyr and he's God's chosen. It's not his fault.
He felt that he'd been betrayed by Ferdinand and Isabella.
What?
He'd found lands for them, and they'd had him arrested and pushed him aside and given the lands to others to rule over. I mean, you can sort of see how that would...
In his demented brain, yes.
He's got a lot of time to mull over this, I think. And obviously the idea that none of them have a right to rule over these people is not part of the equation. He ranted on about all he'd lost, adding, quote, one has to trust that these things were not done by your royal order, unquote. But the wording implies that he didn't think anything of the sort. While Columbus lamented his fate in his cabin, his crew were convinced that the men who went off in the canoes, as you said, had taken the first ship back to Spain. And were even now living it large in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella. And this rumour took hold to such an extent that they were convinced by the Porras brothers to mutiny. Francisco Porras shouted, "I'm for Castile, who's with me?" And the men shouted back, "We're with me, we're with you."
We're with me.
We've got no idea what we're talking about. But, I mean, they're still stuck on the beach. I mean, there's no point shouting, "I'm for Castile." You're stuck on a beach. Yep. Columbus was safe as long as he stayed in bed, but his brother Bartholomew were fighting off the mutineers with a lance. I don't know why he was safe in bed, but maybe had the door locked. But a mutiny was understandable in the circumstances. Yep. But it's one thing shouting, "I'm for Castile," but another problem of how to get off the beach. Well, they commandeered canoes from the Indians. As they took the canoes, they told the Indians to get the payment from Columbus.
I love how you say commandeered when really they stole canoes from the Indians.
Well, they said they'd pay for it, but they should get the payment from Columbus, and that if he wouldn't pay, they should kill him. So even those who hadn't wanted mutiny piled on since they were afraid of being left behind, and so the canoes were hugely overloaded.
Oh, man.
Pretty much the only people who stayed did so because they were too ill to go. Soon the wind got up, and the men began to panic that their overloaded canoes would be swamped. And the bad weather meant that they were forced to return to Jamaica.
Awkward. You know how we borrowed your canoes? You can have them back.
Well, some wanted to go to Cuba, since the prevailing current would take them there. Some wanted to go back and make peace with Columbus, and they stayed in limbo for about a month. Not in the canoes. I think they went back to Jamaica, but after a while they headed back to the beach ships and said, "Sorry." Sorry. Columbus and his few remaining men were rapidly outstaying their welcome with the Indians. Ferdinand wrote, quote, "They're an indolent people who will not cultivate on a large scale, and we consume more in a day than they in 20, unquote. Wow. So he thinks they should be cultivating 20 times as much just to feed them. These people have just rocked up on their beach. Yeah. Columbus's great skill was as a navigator, but that was no help to him now because he could barely walk, barely see, and they were stuck on a beach. They were getting less and less food from the Indians, whether, as Columbus believed, in an attempt to starve them to death.
Or they're running out.
Or whether they just couldn't spare it, yeah. But Columbus had a plan up his sleeve.
Of course he did.
Which would persuade the Indians that they were superhuman beings who deserved to be fed. Columbus had a book called Ephemerades Astronomicae by an astronomer, Regiomontanus. And according to Regiomontanus, there would be a lunar eclipse on the 29th of February, 1504.
This sounds familiar.
Columbus took a risk, since he couldn't be certain of the exact time of the eclipse in Jamaica, but he gathered the Indians together and told them that God was angry with them for not bringing food, or enough food. And he was also angry with the mutineers. Just threw that in just for good measure. They laughed at him. At least they did, until the moon disappeared. And the Spanish were never short of food after that.
Oh,
I expect the Indians were. And if you're wondering about the timescale of all this, it's now 8 months since Mendez had set off for Hispaniola.
Months.
The men were all terrified that Mendez and his men had died on the way, so no one knew that they were encamped there on this Jamaican beach. Another mutiny broke out, led by an apothecary. But then, in March, a sail was spotted on the horizon. At long last, help had come. And you can imagine the sense of complete exhilaration. If you really think nobody knows we're here, and then you see a sail, and you think, they've come. They've come to get us. The captain, Diego de Escobar, came ashore, bringing a barrel of wine and a slab of salt pork, which was very welcome.
Yeah.
What was less welcome was when Escobar announced that he didn't have enough room on his little ship to rescue them, and had really just been sent to tell them that a bigger ship would be along sometime later to rescue them. But in the meantime, jolly well done, and cheerio. And he sailed away. More rumours then abounded amongst the men. Ovando hadn't sent Escobar to tell them help was on its way, because help wasn't on its way. Ovando was just seeing what the situation was, gloating even, enjoying their misery. Because that was just like him, wasn't it? They had been on that beach for over a year, when Mendes' ship appeared in the harbour.
Over a year.
Over a year.
When do you give up hope?
I don't know. When do you decide, well,
they're not coming.
We can't live on this beach forever.
We better start farming.
Or walking or something.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose Columbus probably didn't want them to walk because he couldn't. He might have been left behind. Yeah, Mendes took them, not without difficulty, to Santo Domingo, where Columbus was welcomed with, quote, great honour and hospitality, unquote.
He doesn't deserve it.
Although Columbus said it was, quote, a scorpion's kiss, unquote, especially since Ovando released the leader of the mutiny, whom Columbus had arrested, and punished those who had sided with Columbus. Columbus came quickly to realise that although he was being housed in the governor's residence seemingly as an honoured guest,
he was a prisoner.
He was in fact a prisoner.
Good. But I hope your son's being treated well. Who is now 14.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope they had a nice birthday party for him on the beach. A beach party. On September the 12th, Columbus, his brother Bartholomew and his son Ferdinand sailed for Spain. They had the usual adventures. In the first ship, the mast split. They moved on to a different ship where the mast broke into 4 pieces. But eventually they made it to southern Spain on November the 7th, 1504. And it's miraculous that the 3 of them should have lived to return home. Columbus felt that. I mean, he felt, of course he's going to return home. He's the instrument of God. But for Ferdinand, he saw his father as being constantly buffeted by events.
Yeah.
So I wonder what he really thought of his father.
God doesn't want you here.
No, and he's meant to be the great man who sailed the seas and discovered countries. He'd been in bed all the time. Yeah.
I had to look after
nursed
you.
by Ferdinand. Yeah.
You are no longer a strong man.
And he'd taken them on this disastrous voyage, which achieved precisely nothing.
Yep.
Except claim Venezuela for Spain. And they'd spent an entire year stranded on a beach. Was this really the great leader and navigator? I don't know. I don't know what Ferdinand thought about it. I mean, he wrote a biography about him, praising him, but you can't help thinking...
Were you doing that for your own status? Because if your dad's great, then your family is great.
Yes, especially since there were quite a lot of law cases with the Columbus family trying to keep what they saw as their rights.
Right.
Columbus intended to travel to Seville to tell Queen Isabella of all his adventures and presumably all his complaints about how he had been treated. But on November the 26th, Isabella died.
Right.
And one of the worst aspects of Isabella's death, as far as Columbus was concerned, was that she was the only one likely to fund his 5th voyage.
Yeah, because Ferdinand won't.
No, and after all he'd been through, and in terrible health, he still wants to go back. He wrote repeatedly to King Ferdinand, asking him to confirm his titles and to clear his name from the slanderous things said about him. When Columbus met Ferdinand, the king was very reluctant to give him everything they promised him, because the trouble was these promises had been made before he went on the first voyage. No one had any idea where he was going or what he was going to find there. Now the Americas were proving quite a nice little earner for the Spanish crown, and Ferdinand felt disinclined to share it.
Ferdinand not wanting to give up money? I'm shocked.
Apparently.
Utterly shocked.
Apparently so. I know, they're completely out of character. Columbus had been promised dominion over the places he found en route before he got to China and met the Great Khan. So that meant everywhere, because he hadn't quite reached China yet and met the Great Khan. So everywhere he'd been, he should have had dominion over it. That's how Columbus saw it, but not surprisingly, Ferdinand begged to differ.
Yeah.
And Ferdinand must have looked at this white-haired, practically blind, barely able to walk,
old man,
hearing voices, old man, and thought, he's not long for this world anyway. I mean, what's the point of giving him anything?
Yeah.
Even De las Casas, who wrote reams and reams condemning Columbus, felt that he'd been shabbily treated by Ferdinand.
Really?
And when you come to think of all that's going on in Spain at this time, Ferdinand and Philip the Fair were going head-to-head with Juana playing piggy in the middle.
Yeah.
Ferdinand is also trying to wrestle Naples off France. It's not surprising he wasn't particularly interested in Columbus and his titles.
I'm busy.
Yeah, some of us have things to do, you know. But the king did visit Columbus when he was passing through Valladolid. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But Columbus was too ill to get out of bed and presumably didn't really want to meet the king from beneath his duvet. He just sent his apologies. His sons Diego and Ferdinand were with him, as was his brother Bartholomew and Mendez, who had rescued him from that beach. Modern doctors diagnosed him with reactive arthritis, which not only caused excruciating pain in the joints, but also inflammation of the eyes.
Oh, weird.
So,
Never heard of it.
No. On May 20th, 1506, Columbus died. He was 54. He was initially buried in a Franciscan friary at Valladolid, where he died. 3 years later, his body was moved to Seville.
Why?
They wanted it. They're a tourist attraction, aren't they?
Yes, yeah.
Things. 27 years after that, he was moved to Santo Domingo on Hispaniola, along with his son Ferdinand and his brother Bartholomew. And this was arranged by Luis Columbus, who was, I think, his grandson. Then in 1595, the bodies were moved to Havana in Cuba.
Oh, goodness.
When Hispaniola was taken over by the French. And there's some confusion about that. It's now thought that the body that had been attributed to Columbus was, in fact, his son Diego, and that Columbus is still Domingo on Hispaniola. The body of either Columbus or Diego was then taken back to Seville and buried there as Christopher Columbus. DNA tests were carried out on the body, but since they were father and son, nothing conclusive could be drawn from them. Sadly, Columbus took very little pleasure from his discoveries. As far as he's concerned, he'd failed in his mission. He had gone to find China. He didn't find China.
True.
So,
I'm not sad about that. You do not do anything that deserves you to be happy.
well, that was his own perception of his reputation. In part 4, we'll look at how Columbus has been perceived over the years and what generally we think of him now.
Yeah.
However, much of what we heard about Columbus comes from either the man himself or his son, both of whom are pretty pro-Columbus.
Yes.
So before we do part 4, I'm going to plonk a cameo episode about Bartolomé de las Casas,
Okay.
who had quite a different view of the great admiral, and we might get a more rounded view of him if we look at his books before we rate Columbus.
Okay. I'm already rating him low. He's a horrible person.
Well, we may... Yeah, when I wrote that, I sort of assumed that he'd come across quite well, because he'd written it, most of it. But he condemns himself over and over.
Yeah.
And, in fact, I hadn't written the episode about Las Casas by that point, and I have now, and it's not at all what I expected. He has a lot more sympathy with Columbus than I had expected.
Oh, no.
But so we'll see. I mean, it makes it more interesting because it's not just Columbus saying, I'm a goodie, and De Las Casas saying, no, you're the baddie.
Yeah.
There's a lot more nuanced
Okay.
look. I liked it at Las Casas. He had, he had an interesting way of looking at things.
Okay.
And we will find out next week.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, that wasn't quite so bad as the last
No.
episode, was it? Not so much about the Indians
Yes.
in this one. It's mostly the Spanish ripping themselves apart.
Yeah. Oh.
So, we'll see you next week.
Yes. Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.